Good morning, friends. Um, I'm Jeff Harris, speaking to you from Durban and giving the first address, I believe, in your day seminar on justice and related matters in the Seychelles. Perhaps a speck of background on me might be worthwhile. I'm a professor in the International Centre for Non-Violence at Durban University of Technology. I've got particular interests in restorative justice, which we'll be talking about during this presentation. And I'm particularly involved in an organisation that works in the prisons, 11 prisons altogether, in Zululand, which is somewhat to the east of Durban. And that NGO called Phoenix Zululand, it does have its own website if you want to look that up, works inside prisons, although a bit restricted at the moment with the virus, along with many other issues. So that's just a speck of background. I am not an expert on the Seychelles at all, and what I'll be talking about is a generalities, which you can fill in from your own specific knowledge of the context. I've got a slightly different heading to the one you will find on the program, and it's on the screen now. Nelson Mandela, Retributive Justice and Restorative Justice, Getting the Balance Right, or perhaps trying to get the balance right. That seemed to be the way the research for this paper came out. And the first point I'd like to make is that, in fact, Mandela didn't say a great deal about restorative justice. When I looked into his written work, and he certainly has written a great deal and also spoken a great deal, not much about the theory and practice of imprisonment. So that is in some ways good, because it means that what I will not be presenting is a set of extracts of what he said, and therefore QED. We don't need to do any thinking. Now, the fact that he didn't say so much, although he did a great deal, means that we have to think, and thinking together with others with different degrees of expertise. And I see from the program a range of expertise in both type of work that people are involved in and also the locations. I think that'll be very valuable. So what my presentation is going to end up with are some, what I hope are good questions, which are likely then to provide some valuable insights. So that's the first point. Mandela didn't actually say a great deal. He experienced a great deal, 28 years in prison himself, as you'll be aware. But he didn't then become a proponent of particular ways of imprisonment and that sort of thing. So the first question I think it's worth considering is this one. Does imprisonment meet its objectives? And that's a question we can ask of any prison system. The one I'm most familiar with, of course, is South Africa. But and you'll be able to ask that question about the ones probably at the Seychelles, which you're familiar with, and I think there are people from other countries as well. But there are four main objectives of imprisonment, and they are as follows. One is to remove dangerous people from society. Protect the rest of society by putting people away. Obviously, serial killers and serial rapists would fit into that category. Other people, perhaps less obviously, would fit in there, but we can talk about that later. Secondly, to meet society's desire for retribution, punishment, revenge. Now, that's a very powerful thought. Again, we'll come back to it. Then the third one is to deter future crime. By putting someone in prison, you're certainly deterring them from a crime while they're in prison, and you're hopefully going to deter them from future criminal activity, either because the prison experience was so awful, or because they've learned things while they're in prison which lead them to live a different sort of life. So we talk about that as rehabilitation. And then the fourth one, which is linked to that, is to reform the criminal, that the criminal comes out a better person with different objectives and a different attitude towards life and so on, and hopefully becomes a model citizen if that exists. So those are the objectives. Now the question then is prison the best way of trying to achieve that sort of objective? So on the left-hand side, it says there are many ways of achieving those objectives, the ones we just looked at. And imprisonment is one of them, but it's likely to fail, especially with respect to the rehabilitation and reformation. Now, I say likely because, again, I'm basing this on experience in South Africa, and I'll refer to that evidence in a moment. But I find this quote quite a helpful one, so I'm going to read it with you. Imprisonment offers some protection to society by removing the offender. But consider how limited that protection is compared to what it could be. It puts the offender against property crime, into a place where he's deprived of opportunities to practice the social rules about property. It puts the violent man or woman into a subculture which is governed by violence. It puts the defrauder into a power system where corruption is rife. It puts the sexual offender into a place where sexual relief is only obtainable by substitutes. It puts those who need to learn to take control of their lives into a situation where all significant choices are made for them. And it puts the offender, who is likely to reform, into a milieu where most of the influences on him or her are criminal ones. That's a pretty powerful sort of statement. And it would apply, of course, more to some imprisoning regimes than others. But it's one that's got truth, I think, for just about all systems. Despite that, retribution, which we saw was the second objective of imprisoning people, prevails. Retribution, perhaps I could have expressed that more strongly. That's the one that seems to drive it. If you're talking to the general public, they use words like lock them up and throw away the key. Many people in South Africa, certainly a majority, are in favour of bringing back capital punishment, which was one of the very first things the newly elected government did away with. But it's not the majority opinion. And so the result in South Africa is, as explained in that first paragraph, along with the hugely negative socioeconomic context which face ex-prisoners, those factors, the one we've just looked at, explain why recidivism rates in South Africa are so high. And the estimates and getting figures is actually quite difficult for various reasons. But somewhere between 75 and 90% of prisoners under the age of 30 are back in prison within 2 years of being released. Very high recidivism rates. And I can't speak with any authority for other countries, but I know that in many other countries, they're also very high, way over 50%, which is far too high, you might say, a failure rate. Now, despite all that, despite the problems with facing prisoners in prison, despite the fact that recidivism is very high, retribution is in the ascendancy. And quite a separate point is that the present criminal justice systems that we have emphasise the role of the state over the prosecution of offenders. So, in effect, I'm not sure I've got this in the right place, but bear with me just to make the point. So a crime is committed. A victim may report that crime, and then the state takes over. It says to the victim, basically, thanks very much, we'll take over from here. And they look after the prosecution of the offender and perhaps their imprisonment or some other punishment. Now, the effects of the crime on the direct and indirect victims of a crime is typically ignored. A person may be called as a witness to say, yes, I saw him or her do it, or him or her, they did it to me. But basically, that's all the state's interested in, is using that evidence as the basis of a prosecution. The effects on the victims is typically ignored. And I've mentioned the word indirect victims there because in our work with Phoenix Zululand, what we've realised is that the families of prisoners are indirect victims of their crime. They suffer stigma. They suffer for having perhaps their breadwinner in prison, and so they're indirect victims. And Phoenix work involves dealing with those indirect victims as well. So a retributive sort of outlook on life is pretty common, despite the fact that in many cases it doesn't seem to work. Now we come to perhaps the core of the discussion, and that is, what might Mandela say to us? Now, the fact is he didn't actually say very much, so we have to infer from his other statements and from his behaviour. And I think I found this quite interesting myself. I should say I'm not a South African, I'm Australian, been in South Africa for 21 years now, so I wasn't around when the transition to democracy was taking place. But I have read a lot about it and discussed a lot about it with students. So I start with a principle and then come to two questions, which I think are helpful. The principle is that a nation, and this is a direct quote from Mandela, a nation should be judged by how it treats its, should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones. And its lowest ones means the weaker and more vulnerable. In many cases, women, particularly in South Africa, children, the sick, the poor, and prisoners. That is the principle which I want us to bear in mind. That if we want to be regarded as a civilized society, then we have to find ways of treating, both in a sort of a policy and top-down sense, but also in the way we arrange our institutions, the way we encourage each other to live as individuals, to treat its lowest citizens with respect and care. So I think that's one thing that Mandela will say to us. Perhaps not the most interesting of the things, but certainly one thing. Now, one principle we've just dealt with, and then two questions. And here's the first question. What might traditional African methods of conflict resolution and transformation suggest about the rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners? Now, the discovery of restorative justice in Western countries is in fact not really a discovery, but a rediscovery of what has been there in African and other indigenous societies for forever. Tim Maruti gives just one example of this, but it's one that we could find in many locations. He refers this Mato Aput. Forgive me if there's any relevant speakers who know how it should be pronounced, but this is a traditional system which operates across a whole range of societies in northern Uganda. That okay, you've got a problem. You've got some sort of conflict, some sort of antisocial behaviour happening, and how does traditional society deal with that behaviour or conflict? So firstly, it's a public event. There's a public gathering open to the entire community, and there is presentation of evidence by witnesses. This is not private. This is not just between two people. Everyone's involved. So the facts, you might say, are put out there. Complaints are made and so on. Then the offenders are encouraged to accept responsibility. A very important point. Accept responsibility. It's not someone else, it's you. For the offences, and to repent and to show remorse. Then offenders are expected to ask for forgiveness from the victim, and victims are expected to be merciful and forgive. Right, so there's a key component. I'm sorry, will you forgive me? Yes. Now, the way I said it, that they're just words and they might not sound like they mean very much, but in this context of saying it before the whole community, because the whole community, you see, are indirect victims of what's happened. If someone is raped in a community, it's not only the person who was raped, it's everyone who suffers as a result. They suffer from fear, they suffer from shame, they suffer from the sadness that they feel for the person, and perhaps for the anger they feel against the perpetrator. So it's much more powerful than it might look just by saying, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? But it needs to be said, it must be said. Then, depending on the nature of the case, there may be compensation required. And then in the Mātuaput arrangement, there's a symbolic act of reconciliation between the representatives of the offender and the victim. Now, in that particular case, it's an interesting one because they get the bitter herbs or bitter sort of juice from the root of the aput tree, and they drink it. And that's the symbolic act which brings people together. So that's restorative justice, and I'm hoping you're going to remember that, because that's some of the discussion we're going to get you involved with later involves that sort of approach. And we could have many different traditional societies in Africa and elsewhere where this sort of structure is followed. Now, the second question concerns the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in South Africa, which you'll be familiar with to some extent. And so the question there on the left is, what might the TRC process say to us about the more personal challenges of rehabilitating and reintegrating prisoners? Now, Mandela, I have to tell you, was, well, he wasn't personally involved in the TRC processes. He gave that responsibility to Archbishop Tutu as chairperson, and a number of commissioners and a whole range of support staff. He wasn't personally involved, but when he came out of prison in getting my dates, I won't quote a wrong year. When he came out, immediately after election in 1994, I can speak with authority. He said, we have to have reconciliation between the different groups in South Africa. It's imperative, it's absolutely imperative. And he set forth a process with the end result of which was the TRC. So the TRC process can be summarised as follows. Victims of the apartheid era were invited to tell their stories to public hearings chaired by TRC commissioners. The alleged perpetrators were invited to tell their stories. Okay, 2 words there, well, in both of them, they were invited. There was no compulsion, but there was some incentive. Perpetrators were able to apply for amnesty. Aha, this was the incentive for their crimes, which could be granted if the commissioners were convinced that the crimes were acts with a political objective rather than some personal, seeing out some personal vendetta. And that the perpetrator had made a full disclosure about the events. Now, I'm just looking to give you the figures. Right. In the event, just in case you thought everyone who applied received amnesty, there were 849 applicants who were granted amnesty, and there were 5,392 who were not. So it was by no means clear that a person who applied for an amnesty would get one. I think it's about 15% of those who applied were successful. Now, those who chose not to come to the TRC, who declined the invitation, or who did not apply for amnesty, or whose application was denied, that is the 5,392, could be subject to later criminal prosecution. And then the last one is the Commission recommended that reparation payments be made by the government to surviving members, the surviving victims and their family. So that's the TRC process in great summary. And part of that was Desmond Tutu, who put very much his own personal stamp on the whole thing, including this concept of Ubuntu, the interrelatedness of human beings. And this comes back to this public aspect we've mentioned several times. But let's look at that quote. Social harmony is for us the greatest good. Anything that subverts, that undermines this sought after good is to be avoided like the plague. Anger, resentment, lust for revenge, even success through aggressive competitiveness are corrosive of this good. To forgive is not just to be altruistic. It is the best form of self-interest. What dehumanises you inexorably dehumanises me. That's a fantastic quote. And it does have a lot to say about the ethos that worked its way through in the TRC. Now, what were the outcomes, you might say? Well, I've summarised it there in 4 points. One was, and is a good deal of truth came out. No one is seriously arguing that apartheid didn't happen or didn't happen with the degree of severity that it did. Not to say, in fact, that all the bad behaviour happened on the part of the apartheid regime. There was certainly violence and so on, interpersonal violence from various other parties as well. But a good deal of truth came out. And it's all published there. It's on a website, a listed website at the end. So a good deal of truth. Secondly, some forgiveness. Some of the victims who appeared before the TRC were able and willing to forgive. And there's some fantastic stories about that. When people heard from the killers of their husbands and the killers of their sons. Some of them, many cases coming from a spiritual perspective, were able to forgive. and others weren't, but there were some. There was little reconciliation. This is, of course, a longer term issue. And I think that in particular is hindered by the continuation of extreme economic inequality. And there's a reference to that there. It's one of the features of South African society, extreme economic inequality. Oops. Continued extreme inequality. I've made a boo-boo there, inequality. And then the final outcome is a disappointing follow-up by government, because there was very little by way of reparations, and those had been recommended for some 18,000 individuals who appeared before the TRC hearings, and very little prosecution of those who were not granted amnesty, which had been recommended for some 300 individuals. Yeah, so that's disappointing, and there's a whole set of theories and debates going on about why that didn't happen. I might just say as an aside, there was you will have heard perhaps of the Marikana massacre of 34 striking mine workers by police, which happened 8 years ago. And virtually the same words could have been written about them. There has been very little follow-up by government, virtually nothing by way of reparations, and virtually no prosecution of those who are responsible. So we're coming to perhaps the key point of my presentation, because the key point is to get you to talk and to contribute about that broad question: is there need for more emphasis on restorative justice in the Seychelles? I happen to think, I'm not trying to answer it for you, because I'm going to leave that to you, but I happen to think that restorative justice and restorative practices in general are just a wonderful foundation for any society, or for any household, any community, any society. And in fact, there's an article in the most recent issue of the Seychelles Research Journal on restorative discipline as opposed to corporal punishment. So restorative practice can be wider than simply the criminal justice system that we're looking at ourselves. So the first question is, what words describe the key principles of restorative justice? And the second question, there are 4 main areas in the criminal justice system where more restorative justice could be applied. And that's to do with the police, the laws, the prosecution, the courts, prison itself, and after prison, when a prisoner is released. What initiatives can you suggest in these areas which are consistent with the principles of restorative justice? And the final slide is some references. Just at the very end, some of you might like to look at a couple of two of many DVDs on restorative justice, both from the US and both presented by women, which I think you will find useful. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your seminar.